It is wonderful to see everybody here. My name is Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center, and I must say that this event, where we celebrate and learn from the IHC Faculty Fellows, is one of my favorite events. The IHC Faculty Fellowships Grant, as you may or may not know, is one of the most valuable competitive grants that the IHC administers. It's valuable because it gives time to faculty to concentrate on their research and creative projects. And it's competitive because every scholar and artist needs time to work on their projects. And we receive far more deserving applications than we are able to support. So it's really quite an accomplishment because to get this grant. So the faculty members who do receive the award are designated IHC faculty fellows, and they're released from teaching for a quarter. The best part of this award for the campus community is that faculty fellows come together and share their work with us. And I'm certain that everybody here is going to enjoy learning about these exciting and innovative projects. So what will happen today is that each fellow will speak for 15 minutes about their work, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience for questions and comments. So hold your comments till we've heard from all of our fellows. Before we begin, allow me to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce our first IHC faculty fellow. Heidi Amin-Hong is an assistant professor in the English department. Her research and teaching explore Asian American and Pacific Islander cultures shaped by U.S. imperialism and militarism, uneven global capitalist development, and environmental transformation. Her writing has been published in Verge, Studies in Global Ages, ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature, in Literature and the Environment, and Atlantic Studies, Global Currents. She is co-editor of the critical anthology Empire and Environment, Ecological Ruin in the Transpacific, published by the University of Michigan Press in October 2022. Her IHC-supported book project is entitled A Contaminated Transpacific, Ecological Afterlives of the Vietnam War. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I want to first thank the IHC for organizing this event and for supporting my work through the Faculty Fellowship. Sorry, I'm trying to find the mouse here. Oh, here it is. Okay, so my presentation today is a part of my larger book project. It was challenging kind of trying to fit it into 15 minutes, but I'm going to briefly talk about 3 cultural texts as a way to get to some of my research questions. And it begins today with a familiar cultural artifact that many of you probably have seen or know of, which is architect Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and a famous attempt to memorialize the Vietnam War from an American point of view. And this was built in 1982, which is pictured in this slide. At the 2017 ceremony commemorating the 35th anniversary of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Chinese-American architect Maya Lin reflects on her design for the memorial as a simple impulse to cut open the earth and polish its open sides. The long wall, nestled into a tranquil section of the National Mall, slopes below ground into the earth, and the tallest sections are meeting in the middle. Its surface is polished and reflective. The names of over 58,000 American veterans who perished in the war are carved into the black granite wall. As the viewer walks alongside the wall and enters the indentation into the earth, they see their own reflection merging with the record of the remembered deceased. Rather than adopting a representational aesthetic to commemorate and glorify the dead, Lin's design abstracts the legacy of the Vietnam War into a gash in the American earth and psyche. At the same time, the environmental design of the memorial intends to create a healing space with low walls that facilitate a passage through space and memory. Lynn's proposal indicates that the original site, including the surrounding trees, should be left untouched and incorporated into a public park. The memorial seeks to provide a refuge, a place for mourning and reflection that is integrated into the natural world, and it provides an opening into some of the central questions of my larger project, which are outlined here. I'm thinking through a couple of questions in this presentation and in the broader project, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, which are, how did the Vietnam War and its global legacy shape Transpacific understandings of race, gender, and the environment, not only in the ecosystems that it destroyed, but also in the environmental movements it catalyzed? How do Asian diasporic relationships with land and the more than human world figure into remembering war and the impact of multiple imperialisms across the Transpacific? Asian American Studies scholarship has examined the Vietnam War and its afterlives in memory as constitutive of racialized groupings, gender, and class identities. As Josephine Park argues, the American wars in the Pacific during the 20th century, of which the Korean and Vietnam Wars are a part of, were formative for the creation of Asian American studies and a pan-ethnic Asian American consciousness. Jody Kim also critiques the masculinist hypervisibility of American representations of the Vietnam War, offering Asian American cultural critique as a, quote, unsettling hermeneutic for the dominant epistemologies generated by the Cold War. In my work, I examine Asian American negotiations with land and the environment as intersectional with the legacies of racialization, war, and empire. Negotiations that are fraught and colored by uneven and shifting subject positions that are not easily reducible to a resistant imaginary. Lynn's design cannot be separated from her racialized experience as a Chinese American woman and her negotiation of environmental ethics that is more prominent in her subsequent work. And although she doesn't directly reference the ecological violence of American bombings in Southeast Asia, including the spraying of toxic defoliants, Agent Orange and Purple in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and the subsequent chemical dumping into the Pacific, the memorial implies that the Vietnam War's environmental impact is entangled with its human impact. As Lynn describes in her proposal, the war comes full circle as the two ends of the wall meet, but is broken by the earth that bounds the angle's open side and contained within the earth itself. This brokenness is sometimes interpreted as a gash in the American landscape, but also a scar representing the possibilities of healing. While Viet Thanh Nguyen writes of the wall as a, quote, cut and wound in the earth and a scar and suture that represents the psyche of the American soldier, I suggest that the wall also operates as an enactment of environmental ruination. Putting Lynn's work on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in context with her more recent environmental media art, the Black Granite Wall could be read as an early iteration of ecological thinking in her work. As a material reminder of war, the memorial is also evidence of what is missing from a national narrative that remembers American soldiers but not South Vietnamese veterans or Vietnamese civilians. The Missing Piece project, envisioned by Kim Tran and engaging the Viet Unity Los Angeles community and others, uses this existing structure of the wall to stage a dialogue with space and environmental and familial memory for the Southeast Asian diaspora community. The website explains, quote, visitors often leave items at the wall dedicated to fallen loved ones, or in an attempt to let go of traumatic experiences. However, during a visit to the archive in 2015, we found only 6 items that had been left at the wall by members of the Vietnamese community, unquote. The project collects material objects from Southeast Asian refugee communities to be collectively dedicated at the wall on the 50th anniversary of April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon, and the official end of the war in Vietnam. Dedicated objects include a jar by V. Lay labeled Memories of Home, carrying sand and small plastic toys, representing memories that children leave when they become war refugees. Another dedication features paper boats made from funeral money that are placed on top of an illustration of refugees whose bodies merge with boats and ocean waves. The artist pictured here in the slide, Tiffany Lay, who bends down in front of the memorial and arranges the boats, which reflect alongside her image in the black granite. As the website states, the intention of this project is also to carve out space in front of the wall and in the archive for the voices of those impacted by the war in Southeast Asia. In doing so, Southeast Asian bodies and voices enter the space of the National Mall, and in turn, their memories become cataloged in an official state archive, serving as a counter-memory of the war. This recuperation of a monument space, situated in a national park designated as America's Front Yard, also signifies a Southeast Asian refugee critique of a built environment valorizing a white heteronormative citizen and family. And Asian American attempts to recuperate Vietnam War memories also resist a dominant white American imaginary that wages ongoing wars against indistinguishable enemies. In doing so, the field of Asian American studies has strategically subsumed ethnic specificities under a pan-Asian resistant narrative, which erases the layered and heterogeneous dynamics within Asian American communities racialized as other. In a chapter from Chinaman titled The Brother in Vietnam, Amin-Hong Kingston depicts the narrator's conflation of multiple wars: World War II, the Sino-Japanese War, and the Vietnam War. Kingston's narrator fears that her brother will be drafted and face Chinese enemies in battle, and her understanding of the Vietnam War extend beyond the U.S.-Vietnam dyad to accommodate racialized allegiances and global alliances. Yet, as Josephine Park's reading of Chinaman points out, the war also plays a key role in securing the brothers' position as an American ally, despite China being portrayed as, quote, the enemy of the world, unquote. The narrator's two brothers are granted the ultimate testament to loyalty, a security clearance. So I won't read this whole quote, but I'll point out a couple moments in here which signify this imagined journey that Kingston creates for the brother, which reflects the global reach of American militarism spanning across the Pacific Ocean, enabling the brother to navigate a multi-species world altered by the trajectory of U.S. naval ships. The narrator's brother expects to be deployed to Vietnam and given orders to kill. Instead, he is sent by ship first to the Subic Bay in the Philippines, then to Korea. Eventually, he would arrive in Taiwan and briefly an Air Force base near Saigon. He would go on R&R trips to Tokyo and Hong Kong and also spend a significant service time at sea where he, quote, volunteered for extra duty, sighting dolphins in sea conditions. When the ocean went gold with what he thought were low-flying birds, he climbed down and saw flying fish for the first time. As the brother physically moves through Asian-Pacific environments, he confronts his racialization as an Asian subject of American empire. He observes his complicity in the bombings of Southeast Asia and negotiates the ethics of participation. Quote, he would not press the last button that dropped the bomb, but he would ride the ships that brought the bombs, which his taxes had already paid for, unquote. Later, the brother rides on a helicopter that bombs a jungle and imagines the bomb that they cannot see going off behind them. Kingston's writing here imagines the Vietnam War as a site for Asian and Asian diasporic negotiations with land and citizenship. Expanding on Simeon Mann's historiographical work on the racialization of Asian American soldiers in overlapping imperial projects, I put Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander racialization in dialogue to theorize Asian American relationships to place, which both affirmed and exceeded U.S. settler colonial and Asian global capitalist efforts to contain and transform Asian Pacific environments. U.S. militarism in Southeast Asia and the Pacific produced different material consequences for Southeast Asians, Southeast Asian diasporic communities and refugees, and Pacific Islanders who continue to navigate their loss of land and a reconstitution of human-environment relationships. When the U.S. military formally withdrew from Southeast Asia, it left a material legacy of contamination that spanned across the Pacific. War and multiple imperialisms devastated landscapes and infrastructures in Southeast Asia, enabling new global formations of East Asian capitalism to exploit and extract these environments and the communities within. My broader book project that takes up contamination and containment as a state of being, as well as a new geographical orientation that extends beyond national borders and temporal boundaries. The Cold War doctrine of containment justified U.S. military incursions in Southeast Asia, military aid to Taiwan, and the strategic occupations of islands in the Pacific. In this context, the book project then considers how the policy of containment not only sought to contain the spread of communism, but also imagined the containment of pollutants and populations to geographies deemed remote or uninhabited. Turning to contamination as an analytic, I draw inspiration from anthropologist Anna Singh, who writes, quote, "We are contaminated by our encounters. They change who we are as we make way for others, and everyone carries a history of contamination," unquote. In an era where militarism and capitalist extraction are profoundly intertwined, contamination in its many forms touches us all. Though it may be true that no aspect of planetary life has remained untouched by the material legacy of war, the effects of this material legacy are dispersed unequally amongst racialized bodies and communities globally. Thus, it is necessary to theorize contamination not as a universal phenomenon, but as a racially and geographically differentiated process that changes shape as toxic matter, radioactive byproducts, chemical discharge, militarized toxins transform the bodies and environments it touches over time. Contamination has the potential to remake worlds and reveal new ways of being in common. As a departure from purity and innocence, it also allows recognition of culpability and complicity alongside narratives of solidarity and resistance. The artists and writers collected in my project then demonstrate how contaminated narratives, defined as literary and aesthetic forms, that are shaped by engagements with zones of militarized and capitalist extraction, can rupture narratives of purity and universal progress. Dwelling with these contaminated spaces that engender new forms of affiliation and encounter, we might discover a new way of reading landscapes and non-human lives as intimately entangled with human history. Thank you so much for your attention and time, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations.
Thank you, Heidi. All right, our next presenter is Charmaine Chua, an assistant professor of global studies who works in the fields of global political economy, technology, labor, post-colonial development, social theory, supply chains, logistics, and infrastructure studies. Her work has been published in the Socialist Register, Theory and Event, Antipode, the Boston Review, and The Nation, among other venues. She is also an organizer who works with the Amazonians United, an independent union of Amazon warehouse workers, Cops Off Campus, and the Abolition Journal Collective. Today she'll be discussing one of the 2 books she's currently writing, supported by the IHC, The Logistics Counterrevolution, Fast Circulation, Slow Violence, and the Transpacific Empire of Capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here in week 8 of the quarter. And I'm so grateful to the IHC for giving me some time to process the archival work that I was able to sort of use as the presentation for today, which is based on chapter 1 of my book called The Logistics Counterrevolution, Fast Circulation, Slow Violence, and the Empire of Capital. In 2014, I drove from Eagle Rock to the port of Long Beach and boarded an 8100 TEU Evergreen container ship on which I lived and worked for 2 months as it traveled between LA, up the West Coast, and across the Pacific to 4 ports in China. From my cabin, I stood at the window and watched for a while. Dockers sitting atop their towering cranes moved in unison back and forth across the ship's hull, picking and unloading containers every 40 seconds or so. In the distance rose the smokestacks of refineries and oil terminals, and beyond that, railroads leading to the warehouses, the planned space of logistics stretching far into the distance, both inland and across the sea. What startled me in these visions was how radically different parts of the world could look so similar. Islands blown up in one port, estuarine ecologies destroyed in another in order to shoulder land reclamation projects, all to host the kinds of rectangular block-like universalization of the brutalist architecture of containerization. And so standing in the forecastle of the ship, logistics looked to me like an always already completed picture of itself. What you're looking at in this picture could be Los Angeles, but it could also be Shanghai or Rotterdam, or these days, even Cuba. And so what occurred to me as I stood there, watching in awe and a bit of horror at the monstrosity of the logistical sublime, was that the mammoth reach of logistics tentacles was inherent from the very moment of the container's conception. The first proposition I make in my book project, then, is that logistics from its very inception presupposed its own eventual totalization. It was always envisioned as an extensive and invasive project to organize itself across the whole Earth. When the box was invented, it imagined itself as infinitely replicable. Containerization was not just another means of transportation. Oh, what happened? It disappeared. Never mind. Containerization was always not just another means of transportation. Rather, in one of the earliest assessments of the container's economic potential in 1962, economist R.T. Craik wrote that containerization in its ultimate form would mean that how we conceived of a supply chain as we know it would change. The shipping operation, he wrote, starts at the factory and not at the dock. This vision collapsed production and distribution, 2 formerly separate spheres understood as distinct parts of the economy, into one. The invention of the container didn't just reduce the cost of transportation, it also allowed manufacturers to geographically disperse production, generating a system of mass labor arbitrage to post-colonial nations seen as the site of cheap land and labor, while financially consolidating profits in the core. In Deborah Cohen's terms, this logistical regime stretched the factory across the world, turning logistics into an integral element of what production is, rather than situating distribution as an afterthought. What is puzzling about the story of logistics, however, is how often the progress of containerization is narrated as a settled fact, as if this steel box magically, upon its invention, proliferated across the world without friction. This story is often told in 2 ways. The first is a story driven by a kind of Schumpeterian language of creative destruction, in which the logistics revolution, as it has become to be known, is the result of objective technological developments driven by the genius of entrepreneurial innovation, and the result of successive experiments that created winners and losers in the global economy. So this is familiar to you, those of you who, sort of are familiar with the language of technological disruption. Or in Marxist accounts that seek to question these celebrations of innovation, the logistics revolution is often told as a story of capital finding ways to reproduce itself amidst profitability crises in the 1960s, where capital appears as an autonomous subject, reaching its own inherent contradictions in the tendency for the profit rate to fall, rather than as a social relation structured through struggle. In both accounts, however, the Global South holds a largely passive role. It is largely assumed that underdeveloped countries had nothing to do with these changes. They were only passive recipients of the race to the bottom as sites of surplus value and surplus land to which capital migrated. Yet, experiments with logistical expansion, which emerged in the 1950s and 60s, intersected directly with a period of decolonial struggle. At the same time that the Third World was roiling with unrest and demands not only for national political self-determination, but economic sovereignty at the same time. My project seeks to question, then, this picture of logistics as a totalizing fantasy by telling the story of logistics' rise as a story about imperial anxieties over the threat that decolonization posed to the capitalist economy. If we read the history of logistics capitalism from the vantage point of the Third Worldist project, logistics should be understood not as a result of entrepreneurial genius or as a result of structural shifts in capitalists' accumulation strategy, but rather as a counterinsurgent response to the rising threat of anti-colonial nationalisms and internationalisms in the decolonizing world. What scholars ubiquitously call the logistics revolution, then, I argue, was not a revolution at all. It is rather far more accurate to think of it as a logistics counter-revolution, an ongoing project of state and corporate actors to financially consolidate the means of production and reproduction while geographically dispersing possibilities for multiracial and decolonial solidarity across the supply chain. In 1955, just a year before the shipping container was built, the first large-scale meeting of 29 newly decolonized Asian and African states, representing 54% of the world's population, met in Bandung, Indonesia, to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation. At the center of this gathering, which may be familiar to most of you in the room, was a recognition that decolonization had granted the colonies political freedom only to wrest domination back through economic means. The Third World, they thus argued, was not a place, but as Vijay Prashad has noted, a political project. A project to build decolonial solidarity that could conjoin post-colonial states beyond siloed movements for national self-determination, but to also constitute what Adam Gadachu calls a form of world-making, building the juridical, political, and economic institutions that could secure non-denomination and an opposition to colonial dependency. Central to the priorities of the Third Worldist economies after the meeting in 1955 were to build economic cooperation, stabilize commodity trade and international prices, diversify export trade, seek to reduce shipping freight rates. This is not working, and induce shipping lines to a more reasonable attitude, and as well as multilateral South-South agreements as methods of reparative decolonial finance. Concerns about high freight rates and the loss of foreign exchange to foreign-owned shipping lines had led to a maritime nationalism in the 1970s, an often unremarked part of the project of the Third World. For these countries, shipping was seen as a crucial conduit for decolonization. Since all the exports produced during colonial eras were put on British or other imperial ships to serve colonial metropolises, the decolonizing nations did not have access to ocean-going vessels and were subject to exorbitant freight rates that monopolistic shipping confederations control. And so in order to pursue what the Third World had called import substitute industrialization, a kind of economic policy put forward by Raul Prebisch, the Mexican economist, in 1949, they argued that they had to build national shipping fleets as part of a broader state-managed industrialization strategy that would eventually allow greater domestic control of the price of shipping and therefore sort of lead to industrialization. So I'm going to quickly try to focus on Indonesia, which is where the project leads. As a bid to pursue just such an economic policy, in 1945, becoming the first president of Indonesia, the statesman and revolutionary Sukarno embarked on a 2-decade-long plan to achieve economic sovereignty from the Dutch. Despite gaining formal independence after 130 years of colonialism, the Indonesian economy, he wrote, remained disabled by vampiric colonial capitalism, and foreign corporations constituted the pinnacle of this imperialism, which he termed nekolim, neocolonialis imperialis. Multiple attempts to Indonesianize the economy ensued, beginning in 1949 with Indonesianisasi, the replacement of Dutch expatriates by locally recruited personnel, And then in 1950, with the Benteng Fortjes program, which reserved the import of goods for indigenous merchants and rationed foreign exchange in their favor, directed principally against the big 5 Dutch trading houses in Indonesia. But these seizures really reached their pinnacle in 1957 when members of a local labor union occupied the headquarters of a Dutch shipping company, KPM, in Jakarta, and started a sort of wave of seizures of multiple other companies in the following days. So what you see in the picture is somebody looking out of the KPM firm to graffiti in English, which I'm curious about, that reads, "You must be swept from West Irian." With the formal nationalization of Dutch assets in 1958, Britain emerged soon after as the leading investing power in the archipelago. Oh, God, my slides disappeared. But this would not last for very long. In 1960, Sukarno established the parastatal Indonesian Freight Organization to book and channel the carriage of overseas trade and established the state-owned Indonesian national shipping line Jakarta Lloyd. In 1962, the Minister of Sea Communications of Indonesia declared that the UK company Ocean Steamshipping was the tool of imperialist domination in the field of international shipping and promptly nationalized the company's assets in 1962. British enterprise met a further blow when the merchant house McLean Watson and the plantation management company Harrisons and Crossfield were both seized in 1964. I'm good. Yeah, thanks. Slides disappeared, but we're fine. As the insurance agency and import-export merchant for ocean steam shipping, McLean Watson's seizures stopped a significant share of profits from floating to trading companies in the UK. Harrisons and Crossfield, with over 7,000 acres of oil and rubber plantations across the Indonesian archipelago, had by the 1930s effectively enclosed and evicted thousands of indigenous smallholders from their lands, and its nationalization too cut off a central arm of the British import-export trade. And so you see here a kind of kampong surrounded already by newly planted oil palms, which had been brought from Africa to Southeast Asia principally as a kind of development strategy during the sort of falling era of colonial times for the 1900s to 1930s. Following nationalization, the director of Ocean wrote a long and anxious assessment about what he called the bestiality of the Indonesians in their plot to so-called steal from British companies what they thought were rightfully theirs. Emergency shareholder meetings gathered to figure out how to reroute profit around the threat of nationalization, which they regarded as a communist policy. The directors of ocean steamshipping noted that this aggressive phase of Indonesia's economic nationalism was unwise and demanded that the Indonesian state pay them back for the value of property seized. Holt and other British companies understood this drift to the left as a sign that they needed to withdraw from Indonesia altogether. Decolonization, they wrote, had been a traumatic experience for the British, very poor British, and had become simply too high a political risk for business. And so what the slew of indigenizations and takeovers had done was to shift British shipping and merchant companies away from what they decried as expropriation towards they then regarded as politically safer developed economies. The solution to what these firms took to be the threat of the Third World was containerization. Looking to lower risk, higher value profit margins, ocean steam shipping began to identify safe investments in Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Australia, distinctly anti-communist strongholds, while furthering experiments with containerization during the Vietnam War, which promised, and so these sort of anti-communist strongholds promised both docile populations, and which were then becoming manufacturing centers for high-cost electronic goods. In 1965, 4 British shipping companies, Furnace Withy, P&O, British Commonwealth, and Ocean Shipping, combined their investments and resources into Overseas Containers Limited, the first British bid to transition from breakbulk shipping into containers. The chief reason for consolidation by companies that had previously been locked in competition with each other was that the cost of building out a containerized infrastructure was simply too expensive for a single company to hold, requiring massive outlays of finance to finance the construction of container ships, mechanized cranes, massive geoengineering projects, the building of truck chassis, and an entire intermodal system of containerization. And so these companies needed each other's joint stock holdings, essentially, and a massive infusion of state investment from the UK government, which was struggling to figure out how to sustain its economy in the wake of imperialism, in order to pursue this high-cost, globe-spanning shift in the infrastructure of global goods movement. In this historic move, consolidation was a self-conscious recognition that the ability to capture market share and invest in capital-intensive construction of ships was a strategy to outcompete the Third World's bid for national fleets. Frank Lane, the Elder Dempster chairman, in justifying his company's full absorption into Ocean Group in 1965, noted that despite the threat of maritime nationalisms across the South, the greatest benefits will accrue to those organizations which are large enough to be able to justify the expenditure, which the far-reaching changes of containerization will entail. In this way, I would argue, containerization instituted a technological innovation so costly to construct that the nascent maritime nationalisms of Indonesia simply could not compete. And this was also the case sort of all across the global South and Southeast Asia, including nationalizations in Burma, nationalizations after the Chinese Cultural Revolution, nationalizations in Nigeria, and many other places. Containerization in this history thus became a counter-revolutionary technology for bypassing the low-cost, unruly nationalized economies of Africa and Southeast Asia, whose rampant unrest, nationalization schemes, political and economic instability, labor troubles, port inefficiency, and pilferage all threatened British trade and made UK companies conclude that sidestepping the trade in primary commodities in insurgent strongholds would be a way to shift their business into the pro-West, anti-communist strongholds in low-risk areas in the global South. So I think I'll just skip this and just say really quickly that one of the things that I looked at was Lloyd's reports, Lloyd's insurance reports, which in the history of the Lloyd's Maritime Insurance Agency records sort of innocuous maritime losses like ships being rammed into the sides of boats. But in the 50s and 60s, it starts a unique category called labor losses. And this is where you start to see strikes hitting Panama Canal, Bangkok workers striking over docked pay, walkouts by 860,000 Japanese workers, and then bulletins all across the staff, bulletins of various kinds of companies, kind of reporting on the political, cultural conditions of the kind of decolonizing nations that they were in. And in many of these, it wasn't just national government seizing and nationalizing companies. It was also often the sort of work of labor unions and insurgent separatist movements doing some of these seizure, and also to sort of generalized and unruly unrest from pilferage and seizing. In one report, a company in Indonesia complains that the police were so busy stopping riots in other places that they couldn't come save they couldn't come save goods from being pilfered. So what I try to argue is that what this was a counterinsurgency and counter-revolution, not just against nationalist government formations, but also against what I call the Third World in resistance. In other words, that this counter-revolution worked at the same time against governments seeking national self-determination and internal formations within these newly decolonized nations sort of seeking resistance within their own government formations as well, so that the counter-revolution sort of forms a kind of dual kind of counter-revolutionary system. So to finish, reading the history of logistics and decolonization together, I argue, reveals competing visions of economic and social redistribution. Approaching logistics as a counter-revolutionary form, then, shifts the focus towards the reactionary and anxious nature of imperialism in response to Southern resistance. From its inception, logistics was conceived of as an always-already reactive force. It reacted to and sought to demobilize the potential solidarities of an anti-colonial world over the last half-century and continues to defang emerging solidaristic potentials today. What, then, would it mean to organize our collective potentials across, within, and against supply chains in ways that might make it impossible for capitalism to contain? How might writing insurgent histories of logistics open new pathways for refusal, revolt, and uncontainability today? Thank you.
All right, our next presenter is IHC fellow Raquel Pacheco, an assistant professor of anthropology. Her fields of teaching and research include indigenous studies, gender and sexuality, race and racism, development, migration, and Mexico. She was a UC President's postdoctoral fellow at UC Santa Cruz from 2017 through 2019. And the IHC-supported project she works on brings historical analysis to bear on the nexus between settler colonialism, political economy, feminism, development, and the transformations of the Mexican state, with a special emphasis on the period from the 1960s to the present.
Thank you so much for the support. It's so nice to not know what week of the quarter it is. I'm on leave this quarter, so thank you so much. My talk will be titled Gender Progress as a Pillar of Mexico's Post-Agrarian Citizenship. So much of my time in the Huasteca of Hidalgo was spent in the Instancia de la Mujer of Hoquisingo, a pseudonym I used to refer to a municipality in the state of Hidalgo, Mexico. The Instancia de la Mujer is a local government office now found in every municipality of Hidalgo that provides legal and psychological help to women encountering gender violence. The director of Hoquisingo's Instancia was Yvonne, a personal mestiza or non-indigenous woman who professed to be intimately familiar with the gender violence of the Huasteca region. Yvonne had been born in Hoquisingo to a mestizo landowning family and had married into a Nahua family. A Nahua and Tenec are two indigenous groups in this region. It was this unique positionality as an insider to both groups that made Yvonne especially qualified to provide a gender-themed workshop in this area. Yvonne had also been honing an expertise in gender issues since 2002, when she had been trained by the Mexico City-based Colectivo de Hombres por Relaciones Igualitarias, or CORIAC, to carry out gender-themed workshops in the Huasteca. On one summer day, I got to observe Yvonne deliver a workshop to a group of about 30 men and women in a Nahua community 20 minutes away from Hoquisingo's county seat. Yvonne began the workshop by explaining how unfair local gender roles were to women and men. She finished the segment by trying to persuade the audience that since gender roles were arbitrary and hurtful rather than biological or innate or beneficial, they could and indeed needed to be changed. She then focused on marriage, encouraging men to embrace the idea of the working wife. In making her case, Yvonne addressed the men directly. Men, if you see your wife is going to work, you might hear them say, "Hey, sweetie, I'll be giving you some money for the light bill." Now I have some money left for my beer, some men say, and the audience laughs. Or now I have some money left to buy shoes. It feels good, doesn't it, to share? It's like we value our wife more, and the woman feels confident, equal. Yvonne then proceeded to divide the audience into several groups and asked them to discuss the stories of multiple fictional characters which she had mounted on various poster boards. Yvonne arranged the audience into various groups. The group I joined was assigned a vignette titled Raúl the Taxi Driver. In the vignette, Raúl recounted that while he had allowed his wife to work as a maid, he refused to perform household chores because it was his wife's obligation to take care of the family. The group of community members assigned to this vignette avidly criticized Raúl for being, and I quote, a macho, noting he had the obligation to so-called help his wife with the housework. When Yvonne made her rounds to the different groups, she applauded them for their comments. In the end, however, the workshop ended in tension when Yvonne invited the women in the audience who had cargos or responsibilities in the community to join their growing network of community promotoras, and the male authorities in the audience objected, saying that they had to first ask their husbands for permission. So for while Yvonne, the end of the workshop proved how much work needed to be done in Nahua communities to bring about gender equality, for me, the workshop helped me identify the ways in which institutionalized feminism in Mexico, in great part inspired by some strands of second-wave feminism, is complicit with the neoliberalization of the Mexican economy, a process that has reinforced the marginalization of indigenous women and men to precarious and gendered forms of labor in the cities. So while the vignette, Raúl the Taxi Driver, was meant to persuade the audience that men were equally responsible for household chores, the very way in which the vignette was written obfuscated the servile conditions of indigenous women's paid labor. It wasn't until I returned from the metropolitan area of Monterrey in northern Mexico that I realized how peculiar it had been that Raul's wife had been represented as working as a maid. As a principal node of so-called free trade on the Mexican border with Texas, Monterrey's economy has attracted indigenous migrants from the Huasteca region since the 1990s. While Huastecan migrants to Monterrey occupy the lowest wage jobs and face virulent racism due to their racialization as, and I quote, Indians, indigenous women are mostly relegated to domestic work. Between 90 to 95% of Nahua and Tenec women toil in domestic work in the homes of middle and upper class mestizo residents. And one of, I think, the most wealthy municipality is in all of Latin America is located in this area of Monterrey. So between 90 to 95% of Nahua and Tenec women toil in domestic work, such as the association. Here's a graph of the census in 2000. So it segregates women and men and who speakers of an indigenous language in the metropolitan area of Monterrey by the types of work that they do. And so the women are the darker shade, and you can see that they're concentrated in one type of labor occupation, which is domestic work, while indigenous men, speakers of an indigenous language, are more spread out. So you can see that concentration is very acute. So such is the association between Huastecan female migrants and domestic work in Monterrey that they have become synonymous with the word for female cat, or gata, a slur for maid in Mexican Spanish. For this reason, migrants congregate in their days off as for this reason, mestizo residents of Monterrey have come to refer to the Alameda Park where Huastecan female migrants congregate in their days off as Ciudad Gótica, or Gothic City, in a cruel reference to Catwoman. So taking this aspect of indigenous women's labor experience, the vignette on Raul, the taxi driver, and Yvonne's workshop altogether seem to be encouraging Nahua men and women to enact the dual earning family model and gender egalitarian relationships at home while acquiescing to highly gendered and racialized forms of exploitation outside the home. These gendered and racial contradictions are at the heart of what I call gender progress. So through everyday interactions and at times more explicit workshops, teachers, municipal judges, and government officials in the rural region of the Huasteca communicated to the Nahuas and Tenec that they should so-called modernize by following dominant scripts of the empowered woman and gender egalitarian man. This is one poster on the right side, which I found in one of these offices, and in Spanish it reads, "To live free of violence." And so this is the picture on the left is a picture of interlocutors who I got to spend time with. And so this type of family arrangement in which the man is drinking a beer, these are the kinds of peasant subjects that are seen as targets of these kinds of programs, right? And the need to modernize them because they drink too much, they're too violent towards the women in their households. They don't send their daughters to school, for example. So according to this vision, agentive indigenous men and women are to achieve progress by choosing their spouse rather than deferring to their parents to arrange their marriages, planning the number of children they want to have in line with their career goals and income levels, investing in their children's psychological well-being, and forming dual-earning families. While seemingly progressive, this education reproduces the unequal relations between indigenous peoples and mestizos insofar as this message is channeled through the settler colonial institutions of the state. Furthermore, such ideas of gender progress are based on the racial assumption that indigenous peoples are excessively gender backwards. I examine how the Nahuas are being tasked with becoming gender progressive citizens precisely at the time they are being driven out of peasant agriculture, a livelihood animated by Mexico's post-revolutionary agrarian citizenship. And here we can see Fernando, who's gathering his family to work on the bean harvest. So agrarian citizenship was one of the few paradigms that was meant to subvert the precarity of the Mexican countryside by recognizing rural inhabitants as a productive sector, which would sustain Mexico's urbanization. Yet this reform was based on settler colonial logic in which the Mexican government reinforces sovereignty over the national territory. So after a revolution which questioned the expansion of private property at one time, the post-revolutionary government largely reinforced this regime of private property, offering to redistribute the most infertile lands through what came to be called social property. Social property was to be owned by the state, but used for agrarian production by corporations of peasants or ejidatarios. Throughout the 20th century, executive administrations such as that of President Lázaro Cárdenas, pictured on the right, transferred nearly half of the country's territory to the hands of rural inhabitants through these corporations. For many scholars, however, these social rights only deepened the exploitation of peasants who were forced to accept low prices for their products in order to subsidize Mexico's rapid urbanization in the mid-20th century. In the 1990s, this all changed with the Mexican settler colonial project's abandonment of its national sovereign model for one of free trade. This entailed gradually phasing out the tariffs and subsidies that had once protected its national industries from outside competition. Within this new vision of Mexico, both peasants and the agrarian rights that had sustained them were considered obstacles to Mexico's growth. In 1992, the Mexican Congress approved a reform to Article 27 that ended land distribution altogether. A year later, Congress ratified the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allowed the U.S.'s highly subsidized corn to flood the Mexican market, driving many small and medium-scale farmers out of production. As part of these transformations, the government began referring to peasants as a rural poor, thereby ending Mexico's mid-20th century agrarian framework. Peasants were expected to join the cheap labor market that would attract foreign investors to do business in Mexico. In this new vision, foreign investors and the Mexican government refashioned the northern border with the U.S. into a prime site for economic opportunity. Thus, since the 1990s, finishing middle school has become a rite of passage to migration for many young Nahuas and Tenec of the Huasteca who migrate mostly to the metropolitan area of Monterrey, Mexico City, and other major capitals. Young Nahuas and Tenec have come to perceive migration, even if it leads to domestic work, as the path to social mobility. And here I show how they're recruited into this form of work. So this picture I took in the one of these parks where the indigenous women congregate on Sundays, which is their only day off from maid work. And so employers just pull up like just ordinary people who middle class people or above. They'll park by the park with signs that say, "I'm looking for a muchacha," or a maid, or a mozo, which is the male equivalent, and then women just approach them, right? So it's very precarious, it's very, very informal, and that's how they sometimes just get in the car and drive, are driven to these sites of work. And the bottom picture is of another one of my interlocutors, and this is a home he takes care of as a gardener. He cleans the pool, he mows the yard. It's a pretty big property, but he's mostly alone there, and it's really rural. This is like a summer property for these mestizo families. So for many young Nahua and Tenec migrants, live-in domestic work is the most accessible type of work. Not only can migrants save on rent by living with their employers, but racial ideologies in Mexico characterize indigenous peoples as already trained for domestic work. Moreover, domestic work is largely a feminized occupation. The demand for cheap domestic labor also reflects the rise of dual earning families in Mexico and around the world since the 1970s. As several feminist scholars have noted, women's entrance into paid labor has not resulted in a reconfiguration of gender roles, but rather in the transfer of household labor to the most disadvantaged women, commonly migrant women from the global south. The transfer of domestic and care labor to women of the global south reflects the lack of a public response to the demands of the feminist movement of the 1970s, which called on both the state and men to take up a larger share of reproductive labor. Additionally, governments such as Mexico continue to weaken the rights of domestic workers by maintaining precarious working conditions. In the absence of stricter regulation, domestic work continues to be a colonial labor niche of racialized and feminized labor that is one of the main lifebloods of the neoliberal economy. After interviewing young Nahua ethnic domestic workers who described the lack of upward mobility, isolation, and abuse in Monterrey, it became clear that domestic work could not be equated with female liberation. Few women felt so-called like confident or equal, as Yvonne promised in her workshop, after finishing their 10 to 12-hour shifts or having their food rationed. In fact, many described having to look for other forms of employment that did not seclude or abuse them in the same way. To this extent, my work seeks to show how Mexico's institutionalized feminism has provided the discursive grist for a neoliberal project that only deepens the precarity of Indigenous women and men. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll start us off. Maybe you can each, just in a sentence or two, tell us how your project found you. Why you research what you do? What draws you to this? Go ahead.
Sure. So no. It's on now. I came to my project kind of circuitously in graduate school. I was really interested in how Asian Americans make sense of the environment and relationships with nature, but I was also quite influenced by scholarship on the Cold War in Asian American studies pioneered by people like Jody Kim and Simia Man and Viet Thanh Nguyen, and I have been thinking a long time about, so I grew up in Washington, D.C., which is kind of like the belly of the beast, and I had a lot of personal and more peripheral connections to the military, both through my family and my personal history. So I was thinking about how this legacy of militarism kind of contours the experience of being Asian American and what that looks like in a body of work that is being produced in a new generation of Asian American writers and artists who are the children of refugees and the children of immigrants who have worked for the U.S. military in some way. And I think the project is the beginning of a long process in making sense of that. Sorry, that was much more than one sentence. Thank you. All right, it's one sentence.
I don't really know.
You just found yourself on a...
I think that there's a biographical story, which is that I sort of grew up, born and raised in Singapore, which is sort of constantly surrounded by container ships, and so it was very much a sort of part of my life. But I think I came into the project partly through an interest in forms of anarchist disruption at choke points of the economy. And as I sort of started thinking about that, I started thinking about sort of how it is that massive movements of the economy sort of become constrained into small bottlenecks of trade. And I think that just opened up places, but it's been a really sort of like meandering route through multiple iterations of the argument to get here. Yeah, that's all I can say in 2 sentences, I think.
Yeah, mine is complicated too. Is this on? Yeah. So I was volunteering in Chiapas, drawn there by the Zapatista movement. And one of my friends there said, I was having trouble getting there from Austin, where I was studying at the time. And one of my friends said, why don't you connect with these peasant socialists who are much closer to the border? And so this area that I presented on actually was the site of a pretty broad land peasant movement in which the Nahuas and Tenek took over these vast swaths of land. And so that was my first project. I studied the Peasant Socialist organization. And then it was sad to me to see that these older peasants had taken over all this land, and then all the youth were away. And so when I was there, I would be like, well, where's so-and-so, that was on the picture? And they'd be like, oh, he or she is working in Monterrey. And so there was all this land, but it was unproductive. It was unworked because of NAFTA, right? Because it was no longer profitable to work the land. And so that led me to my second project, which was on migration.
In 2003, I was interested in basically Romani activism. So I was volunteering at it was an educational desegregation organization in Bulgaria. I found myself there through a query on a listserv, and I was really interested in kind of Roma grassroots organizing in the eve of EU accession. Then I went to grad school to do this project, and I arrived in Bulgaria in 2008, and all of the kind of NGO sector that I was interested in no longer existed because they lost funding when Bulgaria joined the European Union, and suddenly all of the funding has to kind of channel through national government entities. So it changed the way organizing was happening, and one of the kind of spaces in which there was this kind of collective voice was actually in the labor sector. And that's how I got interested in waste management, was just really through these spaces where Romani women were highly visible in public space and had this kind of collective life that was not present at the other realms that I had been interested in. And then the focus on pleasure really emerged from the ethnography. I kept having this feeling that I was really, I was always really interested in issues of social justice and racial justice, and that's part of the book, but that wasn't, part of what's also emerging is this felt kind of affective experience of what it means to be in these labor sectors that also involved pleasure. So I was trying to toggle between the experience that was really funny and really, I really enjoyed kind of the camaraderie of, this workplace full of these really funny, smart women, and how to then make that also part of a story that's also about dehumanizing racialized labor. And so that's really what kind of the book ended up being about.
So one, this is not my feud at all, but just thank you so much to all of you for really clear talks, both individually and as a quartet. And the question I have relates to that idea is and being fellows this quarter, has that shaped the way your project specifically has developed in any way this quarter?
We didn't talk to each other, I think, as much as I think I would have loved to in retrospect. Yeah, there weren't sort of formal ways for us to workshop our work, although that would be awesome in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think hearing the talks themselves has given me so much more to think about regarding my own project, like how, Elana, you're thinking about waste and race together, and how Charmaine is thinking about containerization as counter-revolutionary, which is actually really helpful for how I'm thinking through the logics of containment in the new iterations of this project. And I think I was jotting down my notes that all of our talks have this connective thread on labor and feminism and resistance and different forms of thinking about the body that in relation to labor and capital that are really generative. I would love to be able to workshop in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think they all resonate so well that I'm learning so much, and I hope we have the opportunity to share work along the way. I think it would be really helpful.
I think I'll go. Hello, thank you everyone for the talk. Heidi, you kind of just started answering the question that I was thinking through, which was about the through lines, particularly between yours, Charmaine, and Elena's work. And I was thinking about the word containment itself, right? And how to contain is actually found in these kind of notions of not only Cold War policy, but also in the actual physical box in which container shipments are being enacted across. And so I was wondering, like, again, I think you were starting to answer this question, but like what potential through lines are there between these three studies, right? To think about not only, say, Heidi, the way that you're talking about contamination, and then particularly in the way that it relates to waste, but then also in containment and, say, within the container, right? Like what is being contained? What are we trying to contain? Yeah, so.
I'm thinking what really kind of resonated for me is I'm trying to also think through this idea of containability when I think about those recycling bins and the idea of what should be contained in a bin. And you've both kind of expanded my whole framework for thinking of what it means to contain and the politics of that. But it's, in some ways different levels of scale, but I'm trying to also think about it. It was something that I just never thought, for some reason, I never thought of a shipping container within the same realm as the kind of containment I'm thinking about in containing trash, because it's a big discussion. And how do you have an European urban aesthetic? It's about the containment of certain kinds of, people, but also certain types of things. But I don't have an answer, but it just really, this kind of opened up my whole mind to this concept that I was thinking about in a very different way.
Yeah, I think I've been trying to think about my project more broadly as a project about how capitalism tames the unruly. And in a way, I think that sort of brought me to your project, Elana, because the political economy of waste is also super interesting, right? It's wherever waste is, it's very often, and I don't know where Bulgarian waste goes, but waste from the US is shipped back in empty containers that sort of like receive imports to the US and then need to go somewhere. And so most of where that waste goes is into massive Chinese landfills. And so much of the global south is sort of like, given the task of sort of processing that waste. But I think it actually also connects to Raquel's project, because the question of like nationalization and how in revolutionary Mexico there was a moment of national sovereignty that sort of gets replaced by neoliberal economic policy also feels to me like a kind of effort to sort of contain incipient potentialities of revolutionary desire or forms of and articulations of resistance that might have been. Which I sort of like thought was really useful to think about across the projects.
Yeah, I think my project in particular is thinking about the Cold War as a project of global capitalism, and thinking about the container both as a way to disseminate goods, but also a way to disperse toxic chemicals across a global landscape. So in some of my more recent archival work, I've been looking at photographs of Agent Orange incineration in Johnston Atoll, which is where hundreds of thousands of steel drum gallons of Agent Orange were incinerated during and after the Vietnam War. And there's kind of all this detailed descriptions about how the containers themselves are susceptible to corrosion because of the tropical atmosphere of these places, and being transported is actually an incredibly unstable process. And in the process of transport, I'm also really interested in labor migration and the intimacies that occur between U.S. military workers and civilians who are enlisted in unpacking these containers. And I think a lot of this is tied to a story about neoliberal containment of of insurgent movements and a foreclosure of a possibility that occurs after these movements for decolonization.
Hi, can you? Sorry, that was like very high pitched. Thank you all for those wonderful presentations. If I might ask a question about maybe another through line that I was thinking about as all four of you spoke, I appreciated how all of you were highlighting processes of racialization or different ways that race functions that sort of defamiliarize the maybe fixed racial hierarchy we're often familiar with in terms of the United States. And I'm thinking about, to maybe badly paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore, like how race is often an analytic of power more than anything else. So I'm curious if you could maybe expand a little bit on how you're maybe thinking about race or processes of racialization in your work and how that relates to some of your larger moments of critique.
For me, racialization, it was so centered to my positionality because I was racialized in the process of just doing the work because I was always assumed to be an employer or to be part of the families in the Huasteca region that hired them, the mestizos, and so it was always in my mind, and when I went to Monterrey, it was even more palpable because there's just the racial borders there are so stark. So talking about containment, so domestic workers are only allowed to use certain spaces in these homes, and for example, there's the stories of women who are locked overnight because their employers are worried that there would be some of these, forbidden intimacies between the children of the home and the domestic workers, and so there's very, dehumanized versions of containment as disciplinary methods. And containment in the city also happens through containment of indigenous workers in some parks. Like I was mentioning, there's this one park that as soon as domestic workers and their partners started using the park on the weekend, on Sundays, other people started not using that park, and it's become known as Ciudad Gótica. And so there's all these ways in which this false notion of purity that I was really drawn to in your work, Heidi, is really, that's where it all kind of falls apart, right? That it's so hard to, and we have, Trumpist notion of the border wall, and so in so many ways Mexico now is dealing with those, the need to prop up its own borders as the U.S. defers its, business of, keeping migrants away from its own borders. That now Mexico these questions are coming up to the fore. But in my research in 2015, it was not yet as clear, I think. But we see that in the everyday, both in the living arrangements in these domestic these homes, but as well as in the city. And so part of what I track too is how this opens up. This is an ongoing form of settler colonialism, right? In which indigenous people are segmented to these homes and they're no longer connected to their ancestral lands, and so that's it is so connected to like how it's life that is oppressed for the benefit of like the racial, the dominant racial group. And so I have so much to dive into the work too, but I'll stop there.
Should we all? I think.
Do you all want to answer? You have thoughts?
Yeah, I
have. To continue our conversation over wine and cheese. Why don't we finish this question and then we'll adjourn the end.
All right, that sounds good. I think the question of racialization is something I I have to deal with in everything that I write because in Bulgaria, there's a long history of it being that race doesn't exist there. So I think that, and so when I talk about the project often in Bulgaria with non-Romani audiences, they'll say it's just an Americanization of our issues of, cultural difference or ethnic difference, because it really is trying to efface and lateralize like these power dynamics. But the Romani women that I'm always, working with and talking to, both overtly talk about it in terms of racial terms, but also, it's the idea of, it being an analytic of power is very much part of their everyday experience and their everyday reflections and analyses of that experience. But it is, in many ways, always, I'm always having to justify why this is race in Bulgaria, and it is because it is about power hierarchies. And so I think, I often use this example, in teaching, that, to kind of move us away from, epidermalization and to talk about how, race functions, even when, white Bulgarians say race doesn't exist. And so how do you deal with that when there's part of your interlocutors who just say that this is a faulty premise? And so, it's part of the stakes of the work is not just to document how racialization takes shape through labor and through these progressivist EU policies, but that race as an analytic, as a framework of power is part of what, how Bulgarian society is constituted. And the fact of racial disavowal is also part of how that racism takes shape.
Yeah, that's so good. I think the big question of my project has been to sort of try to tease out how racialization works, not just as a sort of epistemic form of direct differentiation, but also is sort of structured through the value form and through capitalist formations, capitalist social formations. And I think one of the sort of persistent things that I see in literatures on race is that sometimes there's this assumption that race needs to be explicitly used as a category of identification or as a category of differentiation in a form that sort of is more visible, let's say, in a period of formal dominion where British imperialists were saying things about the sort of docile population or the sort of ineptitude of the global south. And that sort of ossifies into forms that are actually much harder to read as racialized when they kind of move into the language of sort of the inability to find access into teleological progress. And so I guess I would say sort of more broadly that I try to think about race as a shifting logic of differentiation that works both epistemically through sort of direct forms of domination, but also structurally through indirect forms of domination that are sort of embedded into the structural process of capitalist formations. And so one of the things that my book tries to think through is how it is that, following what Jody Melamed says, she defines racial capitalism as a technology of anti-relationality. And for me, I think it's not sort of just looking for where race arises as an analytic of power, but sort of what race does, right? What racial differentiation does as a tool for rendering possible solidarities more inert by precisely suggesting that differentiation separates different workers from seeing each other as sort of generating of a sort of more durable solidarities in and across things like class differentiations or other ways of sort of seeing power as sort of something that intersects beyond the kind of beyond the logic that sort of suggests that racializations are anti-relational.
Such a great answer. I'm not sure that I have too much. Well, I have so many thoughts on this, and one thought is much more straightforward, and the other is much more abstract. But I've been thinking a lot in this piece in particular about Asian American racialization in relation to war and how Asian Americans, particularly Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino Americans in this period from 1968 to 1975 strategically identify themselves with Southeast Asian insurgent movements in order to challenge the saliency of U.S. empire. And that is both in relation to the subordination of Asian groups into one race on behalf of the U.S. state, and in contrast and in opposition to it. So I guess that's the more straightforward answer, and the more abstract answer would be that I'm interested in thinking about race as distributed across environments, which is something that a lot of folks have already worked on, including people in this room. But I'm really interested in thinking through how environments and structures become racialized, and how race becomes no longer attached to a body necessarily, but to forms of matter that are still present in our lives in different ways.
Well, thank you all so much.